Okay, this week we're going to talk about the birth of rock and roll in the 1950s. I have the 1950s module up here, and I'll be going through the materials within it. If you remember, when we were leaving the 1940s and entering the 1950s, we had three major genres that were going to come together to form rock and roll. And those genres are country, R&B, and jazz or swing. Popular music at the time, more in the crooner era, did not have as much influence in rock and roll. And in fact, it was the rejection and the rebellion against popular music and the crooners such as Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, and Perry Como that helped really define rock and roll. White America is going to become increasingly interested in music coming from the R&B scene. It will also be increasingly interested in country music ideals, and you'll see that country music and R&B start to take over more and more of the radio time. At the same time, swing and dance music is very popular in both white and black America, and the idea of being able to celebrate and party and dance to the music is very important. After years of listening to romantic, smooth jazz music meant to console you, meant to say, you know what, there's a world war going on and the depression going on, but you are okay. We now have more money and more time, and it's time to celebrate. Rock and roll comes along in 1955, and it is an amalgamation of those three. In some ways, what rock and roll is country musicians singing R&B songs in a jazz swing style. And you're going to hear that as we start to introduce all these artists. If I come back over here, I have the meta themes that we've been talking about in this class open. We can take a look at those. If we look at early rock and roll, and I'm just going to list it here. If we look at early rock and roll, let's look at the individual themes that help shape it. One is it simple or complex? One of the defining features of rock and roll in its early years is simplicity. It's very simple. Part of this is because of the instrumentation. For the first time, we have electric guitars and electric basses and a drum set, and they can work together. You don't need a large, big band of 40 or 50 people to get just as much noise. Rock bands end up pushing jazz out of the mainstream because of their noise. They're so loud. It's also easier to coordinate 3 or 4 people rather than 40 or 50 people. Rock and roll comes out with very simple chordal movement based on some of the R&B and country music that we had heard before that. We're going to hear the song sections are all going to be in the AAB form. AAB. So we're going to hear simple instrumentation and simple song form in early rock and roll. Theme 2, is it black or white America? Well, it is white Americans imitating what they've heard rhythm and blues players doing primarily. When we hear Elvis sing It Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, we've heard Big Mama Thornton singing that song 4 or 5 years earlier. White Americans start doing covers of black American and rhythm and blues songs as well as country songs. So it is white imitating black American sounds. Is it rural or urban? Well, for the first time, we have a music genre that can span both rural and urban. It is mainly urban, but also rural, because we are having the emergence of a couple things. One is suburbs, which are between urban and rural living. These suburbs are being funded by the GI Bill, with veterans returning from World War II and being placed into suburban tract homes for the first time. Start to have the idea of the suburbs. And the second important component of that is television. Now anyone can watch Elvis Presley anywhere in the country, whether they're in a rural or urban area. TV spreads extremely quickly in the 1950s and plays an important role in popularizing rock and roll. Theme 4, is it rebellious or is it mainstream? It is extremely rebellious right from the get-go, and rock and roll will maintain the idea of rebelliousness until the very end. It is rebellious because it is catering to a new generation, the baby boomer generation, and these are the children of people who were involved in World War II. Baby boomers were being born starting in about 1945. So when rock and roll emerges, they are 10 to 12 years old. They are very young. And this music starts to appeal to them because it sounds different and new from what their parents were listening to. Remember, their parents are listening to Perry Como, Nat King Cole. Along that vein, is it something new? Yes, it's very new. This has never been heard before. It is in some ways a perfect amalgamation of country, rhythm and blues, jazz and swing, and the technologies that are available at the time, which includes the electronic instruments and television. Is it personal or commercialized? Early rock and roll is actually more commercialized than we'll hear in later rock and roll. So it is sort of a balance of personal and commercialized. Because the bands get smaller, there's a more personal feeling to the music. Oftentimes, the artist and the songwriter are the same person. As we move forward in rock and roll, that becomes a very defining part of it, that the person who is singing the song is also the person that wrote the song. In early rock and roll, we're going to hear a little bit of both. We'll hear some people doing covers of songs, such as Bill Haley and the Comets and Elvis. We'll also hear people who are writing their own songs, such as Buddy Holly or Chuck Berry. So there's a combination of this sort of personal and commercial realm. Part of the reason that rock and roll can become so big is that the commercial companies get behind it. The record labels get behind it. The radio stations get behind it. They are trying to find a way to make money off this new generation of youth. Theme 7, technology. We've already talked about that a little bit, but the two biggest pieces of technology are that the instruments are electronic in nature for the first time, and that we have television to promote it. We also have more widespread FM radio. The transistor radio was also developed in 1954 and began to make it so people could listen to music on their own and have a more personal relationship with the music. This allowed younger people to be listening to songs that their parents might not have originally let them listen to. So here we've got the instruments, we have TV, radio, and we also have better recording techniques. Okay, so we've developed the tape recording systems so we can start to have overdubs and better recording of the individual instruments. The next theme. What was happening in the world to influence this music? Well, the most important thing that was going on was the arrival of the baby boomer generation. In many ways, rock and roll is not separable from the baby boomer generation. It is the soundtrack for that generation. It arrives when that generation becomes of listening age, and it goes away when their children start to take over in the last 10 or 15 years. In fact, hip-hop just surpassed rock and roll in the year 2017. So rock and roll is the most dominant selling genre from 1955 until 2017. It is also the peak of modernity, and I'll put modernism. What did that mean? The idea of modernism is that there is a single truth, and that truth can be discovered through reason and examination, and that mankind can overcome nature. Mankind is designed to overcome nature, and what we see in the 1950s is a lot of that sort of attitude and approach. If you look at things like the 1950s cars, they're very modern looking. They don't look natural. They really have clean lines, and they're designed to look futuristic. Houses during the period were the same way, like the Jetsons. The Twinkie might be the ultimate modernist design in the 1950s. Wonder Bread, things that do not exist in nature because mankind can make them. Man doesn't need nature. Man overcomes nature. We look at the styles and we look at the art from the 1950s, it mirrors that same kind of modernist approach. When people talk about making America great, they're usually referring to the 1950s. Part of that was that for a lot of people, America was great at the time. If you were a white returning veteran from World War II, the government had helped put you into a house in the suburbs that were relatively safe. You were able to afford a house. The middle class was thriving because of the industry built in after the war and the reinvestment and the high tax rates that the government was applying. And it was a very good time to be in the few that had it. Now we're going to learn when we get to the 1960s that not everybody, it wasn't equal. Not everybody had the same access to the resources that a lot of people had in the 50s. And that's going to cause a real change. Rock and roll will be the soundtrack for that change as well. At the time we were in the Cold War. There is the ongoing tension between the United States and Russia. There is a strong sense of nationalism. In general, people are supporting the government and what it does. If you don't support the government and you begin to question it, in some places you can get in trouble. There's the blacklisting going on, the labeling of people as communist. So there's a strong sense of national identity. We're in a modernist period. We're doing pretty well in the suburbs. If we are there, our children are the baby boomer generation, the largest generation to exist on the planet. Finally, we get to the last theme. What purpose does the music serve? It serves to dance. And early rock and roll is dance music. It draws a lot from that jazz swing feel that had been going on. And we are now going to jump up on the tables in the house and be rebellious and dance and party. And that's what early rock and roll is for. Here's an example of analysis using our meta themes on rock and roll when it first came out.